In the heart of the 18th century, England was a land of green hills, quiet villages, and simple trades. But beneath the surface, a quiet revolution was brewing, driven not by swords or politics, but by wool, coal, and iron. It began in cottage industries, where families spun thread and wove cloth by hand with rudimentary tools, passing down skills from generation to generation. Merchants traveled muddy roads to gather textiles, and farmers balanced their work in the fields with spinning wheels in their homes. The rhythm of life was slow, steady, and rooted in tradition. Yet whispers of change rustled through the country like an invisible wind. Cities like Manchester, Birmingham, and Leeds began to swell with activity as tinkers, blacksmiths, and entrepreneurs started dreaming bigger. The soil of England, though modest in its reach, was rich in resources. Coal mines dotted the northern landscape. Iron ore lay beneath hills waiting to be unearthed, and rivers flowed freely ready to turn wheels and carry goods to distant ports. This geographical fortune was paired with a growing population. More hands meant more labor and more consumers, both of which were vital for the coming transformation. It was James Watt's improvements to the steam engine that ignited the flame. His ability to make the engine more efficient meant factories could now be built anywhere, not just near rivers. Steam turned gears faster and stronger than any human or animal, and with it came a tidal wave of mechanical innovation. Cotton mills, powered by steam engines, began to dominate towns, their chimneys billowing smoke into skies that had once been clear. Children and adults alike worked in shifts to keep the looms turning, and raw cotton, mostly imported from colonies like India and the American South, was spun into fabric at breathtaking speed. The world began to take notice of England's rising might on the global stage, but with prosperity came problems. The very machinery that empowered the nation also chained many to grueling labor. 14-hour workdays in poorly ventilated mills where common safety was an afterthought, and the machinery, though miraculous, was unforgiving to careless fingers. The Industrial Revolution was a beast that fed on human effort and sacrifice, and it devoured tradition with every turn of its steel wheels. Yet the promise of a better life drove people from the countryside into growing cities, seeking not just wages, but a future for their children. Education began to shift as well, with more emphasis on arithmetic and literacy to serve the needs of an industrial economy. Factories demanded not just brawn, but brains to manage inventory, track costs, and operate increasingly complex machinery. Thus began the transformation of England from a land of pastoral simplicity to the beating heart of global industry. The march of progress could not be halted as iron tracks stretched across the landscape, bringing with them locomotives that screamed through valleys and tunneled through hills. The railways were arteries feeding the industrial heart of England, pumping coal, steel, and workers from town to town, from factory to factory. George Stephenson's rocket was more than an engineering marvel. It was a symbol of a nation. Hurtling forward at a pace no one had imagined, possible towns became cities overnight. Small market villages like Manchester and Sheffield transformed into dense urban jungles where factories loomed like cathedrals of commerce, smokestacks pierced the skies, turning once blue horizons into a permanent haze of gray soot settled on window panes, clothing, and lungs alike. But still they came by the thousands. Farmers abandoned plows for machine levers. Artisans traded chisels for clock punches. And families crammed into tenements where disease, poverty, and crime flourished amid the clamor of machines. The streets pulsed with life. Children with hollow cheeks darted between carts. Peddlers shouted their wares, and factory whistles marked the passing hours like the tolling of a relentless iron bell. The people became cogs in a larger system, and the line between man and machine blurred as workers repeated the same tasks hour after hour, week after week. Some grew wealthy beyond imagination. Factory owners lived in grand estates far removed from the smoke and sweat of their laborers. Their wealth built on the backs of men, women, and children who toiled for pennies. Reformers and thinkers began to rise among them, demanding justice for The working-class voices like Robert Owen and Charles Dickens spoke of the indignity and suffering they witnessed, calling for laws to limit working hours and improve safety. Yet for many, change was slow and suffering constant despite the harsh conditions. A culture of resilience emerged. Music, literature, and even humor grew in the shadows of the mills and smokehouses. Communities bonded over shared hardship, and the working class developed a spirit that refused to be broken as technology advanced. So too did the tools of production. Iron gave way to steel machines, became more precise, more powerful, and more dangerous. Henry Bessemer's process revolutionized steelmaking, making it cheaper and faster to produce, enabling new bridges taller. Buildings and stronger railways engineers and inventors thrived in this environment, creating devices that seemed to defy the very laws of nature. Telegraphs shrank the world spinning. Jennies increased output, and mechanized looms wove patterns. Faster than any hand ever could scientific societies flourished, and patents were filed by the hundreds. As England surged ahead in the race for industrial dominance, global trade exploded as ships laden with English goods crossed oceans to supply distant colonies and foreign markets. British textiles were worn from Cairo to Calcutta. Machinery was exported across Europe and beyond England's economy grew fat on exports, and its factories ran day and night to meet demand. The very concept of time shifted to accommodate the new industrial order. Clocks now dictated life with shifts scheduled down to the minute. Punctuality became a virtue and lateness a sin. Families adjusted their rhythms to fit the beat of the machines. Sunday remained sacred. But the other 6 days belonged to the factory bells. Church-going men became overseers. Young boys became chimney sweeps, and mothers worked looms with babies strapped to their backs. Legislation eventually arrived to temper the worst abuses. The Factory Act and other reforms began to limit child labor mandate education and impose basic safety standards. Though often poorly enforced, they marked a turning point, showing that even as England industrialized, it could still be stirred by conscience and compassion. The rise of trade unions added a new force to the social landscape as workers banded together to demand fair wages, safer conditions, and dignity. Their strikes and protests were met with resistance, but they laid the groundwork. For future labor rights, the industrial titans of England were not merely machines and managers. They were millions of men and women united by sweat struggle and the shared hope that tomorrow would be better than today, with every steam engine forged. And every railway laid England grew stronger and more complex. No longer just a kingdom of kings and castles, it was now a powerhouse of pistons, precision, and progress, ready to shape not just its own future, but that of the entire world. As the engines of England roared louder, the reach of its industrial might extended far beyond its borders. The factories did not operate in isolation. They were part of a vast network that spanned continents, drawing raw materials from colonies and sending finished goods back in return. The British Empire became both supplier and customer, feeding the ravenous appetite of industry and profiting from its output. India provided cotton, the Caribbean sugar, Africa rubber and minerals, while Canada and Australia offered timber, wool, and coal. These resources arrived in English ports on steamships, unloaded into warehouses, and transferred to mills and foundries for transformation. The empire was not just a political entity, it was the lifeblood of the industrial titan, and England was its beating heart. But this global system was built on more than trade. It was built on control, on domination, and on exploitation. The same steamships that carried goods also carried soldiers. The same railways built in England were exported to the colonies to move troops and resources quickly across conquered lands. Imperialism and industrialism became partners in progress and in oppression. The wealth generated from colonies poured into London, Liverpool, and Bristol, funding rail lines, city expansions, universities, and palaces, while the people in those colonies often lived under harsh rule with limited rights. The contrast was stark, but within England, few questioned the morality of empire as long as the wheels kept turning within the country itself. The pace of innovation continued to accelerate as factories became more specialized. Industries grew into clusters: iron in Sheffield, textiles in Manchester, shipbuilding in Newcastle, chemicals in Birmingham. The division of labor and location maximized productivity, and with it profits. England was now not only producing more, it was producing smarter. The education system began to reflect the needs of this industrial empire. Technical schools were established to train engineers, chemists, and architects. Universities partnered with industries to pioneer new methods and materials. Science and business intertwined like never before, producing thinkers who were both dreamers and doers, names like Faraday, Darwin, and Brunel became symbols of an era where knowledge and innovation were prized alongside discipline and hard work. Women, too, began to find places in this new world. While still largely excluded from leadership roles, they worked in factories, offices, and schools. Many became teachers, nurses, clerks, and textile workers, and while their wages were often lower and their conditions harsher, their presence was undeniable and growing. Slowly, society began to recognize that progress must include all hands, not just those of wealthy men. Cities, meanwhile, grew denser, more connected, and more dependent on infrastructure, public transportation, water systems, sanitation, and gas lighting. All emerged to meet the needs of growing populations. London became the largest city in the world, with sprawling suburbs stretching beyond. The eye could see rows of brick houses lined cobblestone streets, while gas lamps flickered in the foggy nights. The sound of horses, carriages, and factory whistles blended into a symphony of modern life. But even as England rose to dizzying heights, cracks began to show. The same machines that brought efficiency also brought displacement. Handloom weavers found themselves outcompeted by mechanized mills. Craftsmen were replaced by interchangeable parts, and skilled trades faded into obscurity. Unemployment, riots, and machine breaking swept through parts of the country as workers fought to retain their dignity and livelihoods. The Luddite movement became a symbol of resistance to change, not because its followers hated progress, but because they saw how it was being wielded without care for the human cost. Reformers, philosophers, and journalists began to question the true price of industrialization, not just in sweat and blood, but in soul. What was England becoming in its race to produce more and faster was something being lost in the steam and smoke. Despite these concerns, the forward momentum continued, driven by competition pride and the sheer weight of success the world watched, and many tried to imitate. Prussia, France, and the United States began to build their own factories, their own railways, their own industrial dreams. But England remained the model, the original, the titan that first walked the path from field to factory, from craft to capital, from tradition to transformation. Yet even the most powerful engine must be maintained, and the industrial titan stood at the edge of a new era, one where it would have to reckon with the consequences of its own unstoppable drive. The industrial titan marched into the 19th century with thunder in its steps and smoke trailing behind its ambitions, but power came with a price, and England was learning to count its costs. The sheer scale of production demanded ever more fuel, and raw material mines burrowed deeper into the earth, and forests fell to make way for factories, railroads, and growing town. Coal became the new king of energy, and entire regions were reshaped by its extraction. Blackened faces and broken backs marked the miners who brought it to the surface, while the air they breathed turned thick with soot and ash. Yet coal powered everything. From household hearths to ocean liners, it was the lifeblood of locomotives and the fire in the belly of steel mills. England was unstoppable and yet uneasy. Industrial expansion was no longer just an economic movement. It was a force that shaped class culture and conflict. The divide between the rich and poor widened. Factory owners amassed wealth that rivaled old aristocracy, while the working class toiled under unrelenting demands and constant supervision. The cities they lived in were Crowded, unsanitary, and vulnerable to disease epidemics like cholera and typhus swept through tenements claiming lives by the thousands, and while some reformers pushed for public health and housing improvements, their efforts often moved slower than the spread of illness. But necessity sparked action and innovation, and England began to reimagine its urban world. Sewers were built, water systems purified, and hospitals modernized. By the mid-19th century. Urban planning had become a science, and public health a political issue that could no longer be ignored. Amid these changes, a new force was rising. The voice of the working people unions gained strength and momentum, fueled by strikes, petitions, and parliamentary lobbying. They became a driving force for reform. Child labor laws, minimum wages, safety regulations, and the right to organize were no longer distant dreams. They were becoming demands. Some protests turned violent. Clashes between workers and police painted the streets red. But they also turned the tide of legislation. The Chartist movement called for political rights that would give workers a voice. And while it faced defeat in its time, its influence lingered, shaping the future of democracy in England and beyond. Alongside this domestic unrest, England faced global shifts. The American Civil War disrupted cotton supply chains. The rise of Germany and the United States threatened industrial dominance, and rebellions in colonies forced the empire to reconsider its governance. But perhaps most pressing was the competition of ideas. Socialism, communism, and anarchism spread across Europe, challenging the capitalist model that had fueled England's rise. Thinkers like Karl Marx, who spent years writing in the British Museum, declared that the Industrial Revolution had not liberated humanity, but enslaved it under new masters, the factory owners, the landlords, the bankers. These ideas gained traction among the oppressed and unsettled, many in power, sparking fear of revolt and revolution. Even as England expanded its railways across India and laid telegraph wires through Africa, it wrestled with the reality that innovation alone could not guarantee stability. For every factory that opened, a question followed: who benefits and at what cost? Yet the nation still surged forward. The Great Exhibition of 1851 showcased England's triumphs. Beneath the glittering glass of the Crystal Palace stood machines, textiles, locomotives, and scientific wonders, all proudly labeled "Made in Britain." It was a celebration of progress, a declaration that England was the workshop of the world, admired, envied, and unmatched. The exhibition drew millions of visitors and signaled that the industrial titan was not merely surviving, it was thriving. But the world was changing too fast to stand still. Technology leapt forward. Electricity began to replace gas in lighting homes and factories. Telephones connected voices across cities and countries, and engines grew smaller, quieter, more efficient. The old steam machines began to rust as new power emerged, and with each advancement, the workforce had to adapt, retrain, or risk being left behind. Education shifted once again, favoring technical skills over classical studies, and the state began to invest in schools, libraries, and universities designed to equip the next generation with the tools to command the machines rather than be commanded by them. Women pushed harder for inclusion. Suffragists demanded the right to vote, and factory girls proved their worth in the industrial economy, refusing to be invisible any longer. The world was watching, and England stood at the center of a vast spinning wheel, a titan that had built its strength on coal, steam, and steel, but now had to decide what kind of power it truly wanted to wield. The industrial age had made it mighty, but it would take wisdom, vision, and courage to ensure that might did not destroy the very society it claimed to uplift. By the close of the 19th century, England stood tall among nations, its factories humming day and night, its cities pulsing with electric lights and iron tracks, its ships crisscrossing the oceans, bearing goods stamped with British pride. Yet, within this mighty machinery, echoes of wear could be heard. The industrial titan that had once been forged in steam, and ambition was facing questions no amount of coal could quiet. What had all this progress cost the children raised among whirring gears who never saw a countryside? The rivers once pure, now thick with dye and waste. the workers bent with toil, whose hands shaped the modern world yet owned so little of its comfort? The answer was complex, for every life improved by invention, another had been diminished by exploitation, and yet the wheels continued to turn, powered now by electricity and oil. By the ideas of innovators who stood on the shoulders of steam engine giants. Change was no longer just mechanical. It was intellectual, cultural, and global. As the 20th century approached, England found itself grappling with its legacy even. As it sought new directions, universities became incubators for invention, and reflection institutions once reserved for the elite began opening their doors to a wider world, and within their libraries and laboratories, new generations questioned what their ancestors had built. Science surged forward in leaps and bounds. Charles Darwin's theory of evolution challenged centuries of belief, while Michael Faraday's work with electromagnetism paved the way for the electrified world to come. The steam that had powered the old age began to fade from the skylines, replaced by invisible currents of power, buzzing through wires, illuminating lamps, powering trams, and running factories with a quiet efficiency that would have seemed like sorcery to those who first cranked the wheels of industry. Yet even as power sources changed, the structures remained. Men and women still worked long hours, though unions had won concessions and laws had begun to regulate the harshest abuses. Inequality persisted, though veiled in modern clothes and polite society. The poor still crowded into slums. The rich still profited off systems they had not built, but inherited. And the middle class emerged as a bridge between two Englands, one of heritage and one of hope. Industrialization had created not just machines, but identities. People began to see themselves not just as English, but as workers, engineers, dreamers, inventors, and citizens of a global world. The empire which had once fed the factories began to shift as well. Colonies pushed back against exploitation. Voices rose from India, Africa, and the Caribbean, demanding autonomy, dignity, and equality. The same printing presses that had spread ideas of commerce now printed calls for justice. The same railways used to extract resources now carried revolutionaries to meetings. The tide of independence was beginning to swell, and England would one day find that its greatest legacy was not just what it built, but what it inspired. The impact of the Industrial Revolution reached into every corner of life. Art and literature responded with both awe and anxiety. The poetry of Blake and the novels of Dickens painted vivid pictures of life under the chimneys and behind the factory gates. Artists wrestled with the machine age, wondering whether progress had made man more powerful or more alienated. Yet others celebrated the beauty of steel and the rhythm of production, seeing in gears and pistons the shape of a new world culture. And industry intertwined in ways never before imagined. Music too changed. New instruments, new sounds, and new audiences emerged as cities grew and technology evolved. The phonograph recorded voices once lost to time. The radio would soon broadcast across oceans, carrying the heartbeat of a nation beyond its shores. And with every note, every story, every invention, the image of England as the workshop of the world became more than a slogan. It became a mythology, one that spoke of power, perseverance, and paradox. The industrial titan was not perfect. It had stumbled, it had scarred, it had sacrificed, but it had also reached higher than any civilization before it, daring to harness the very forces of nature and bend them to human will, and in doing so it had taught the world to imagine the impossible and strive to make it real. The legacies of this era live on in ways seen and unseen in the cars we drive, in the lights we flick on, in the global systems of trade, education, and labor that trace their roots back to those soot-filled streets and steam-shrouded towns of 18th and 19th century England. The DNA of industrialization is now global, but its birthplace remains engraved in the landscapes of Manchester, Birmingham, Leeds, and London, where canals once carried coal and now reflect skyscrapers in their waters. As the 20th century dawned and then gave way to the 21st, the industrial titan did not vanish. It evolved, morphing into a digital dream where data, replaced steam and silicon, became the new steel. But behind every algorithm, behind every screen, lies the same desire that fueled those first machines. The desire to solve, to build, to connect, to transform. England may no longer produce the bulk of the world's goods, but it still exports ideas, innovation, and inspiration. Its legacy is found in classrooms, in courtrooms, in corporate boardrooms, in the rights of workers, in the dreams of inventors, and in the enduring question of how to balance progress with purpose. The Industrial Revolution was never just about machines. It was about the human spirit, our ability to imagine a better world and work relentlessly toward it, no matter the cost or challenge. The story of how England became. The workshop of the world is not just history. It is a mirror held to our present, asking us what kind of world we wish to create and who we wish to become in that world. The Titan may rest, but its heart still beats in every factory that hums, every engine that roars, every mind that dares to dream. It is a reminder that greatness is built not in comfort, but in courage, not in certainty, but in curiosity, and that the true engine of change is not coal, nor steam, nor wire, nor code, but the human, heart ablaze with vision and unafraid to get its hands dirty in the making of tomorrow.